On the morning of my 18th birthday, I found a check sitting on the kitchen table with my name on it. The amount? $250,000. I almost dropped it out of sheer disbelief. It wasn't just the number that floored me. It was who it was from. My grandfather, a man I only saw at Christmas and maybe once more during the year, had decided to celebrate my adulthood by giving me $250,000. The man was a self-made millionaire who rarely gave gifts, so this was a bombshell. When I showed the check to my parents, I expected a mix of surprise and maybe a little pride. Instead, my mom's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack, and my dad just stared at the paper like it was a ticking time bomb. Before I could say anything, my mom snatched the check out of my hand and said, "We need to talk about this." What followed was a heated 2-hour lecture about responsibility, money management, and how I wasn't mature enough to handle that kind of money. My dad chimed in with stories of kids who went off the rails when they came into large sums too early. They even brought up my cousin Mark, who blew his inheritance on a failed taco truck business and now works at a gas station. The conversation ended with them saying they would hold on to the money for me until I was ready. Here's the thing. I'm not stupid. I wasn't planning on buying a sports car or jetting off to Vegas to blow it all at a blackjack table. I had been accepted into my dream college and thought this money would be perfect to cover tuition and some living expenses. But they were adamant, and before I could argue, my dad walked out of the room with the check. I tried calling my grandfather later that night to explain what had happened, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next day, he texted me, saying he had spoken to my mom and dad, and he hoped they were doing what's best for me. My stomach sank. I didn't know what they told him, but I could guess it wasn't flattering. The months that followed were frustrating. Every time I brought up the money, my parents would dodge the question. "Don't worry about it" became their favorite phrase, which only made me worry more. I started to notice small changes around the house. A new flat-screen TV in the living room, a fancy espresso machine in the kitchen, and my mom's closet suddenly overflowing with designer bags. When I asked if they were using my money, they scoffed at the idea and told me I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe them, but things didn't add up. My dad, who worked a stable but modest job in accounting, suddenly announced that we were taking a family trip to Europe that summer. My mom casually mentioned one day that they were considering remodeling the kitchen, and I couldn't help but notice the shiny new SUV parked in the driveway. Still, every time I pressed the issue, they brushed me off. I tried to get back in touch with my grandfather, but it seemed like my parents had cut off that avenue too. Whenever I asked about visiting him, my mom would claim he was too busy or out of town. It felt like they were trying to isolate me from him, and it only made me more suspicious. The breaking point came when I got a letter from my dream college, saying my financial aid application had been denied because they considered my substantial assets. I sat on my bed, holding that letter, shaking with anger. My parents had taken my money, my future, and used it for themselves. I felt like I was losing control of my life. But what happened next? Well, let's just say this story gets way messier before it gets any better. I confronted my parents the same day I got the letter from the college. I stormed into the living room, holding the paper like it was evidence in a court case, and said, "Care to explain why my financial aid got denied because of money I don't even have?" My dad looked at me, clearly caught off guard, while my mom gave me her usual, "Calm down, you're overreacting" look. Overreacting? I practically shouted. They think I have $250,000 sitting in an account. Where is it? My mom sighed like I was the unreasonable one and said, "We told you. We're holding on to it. It's for your own good." For my own good? I snapped. I need that money for college. How is me getting denied financial aid because of it for my own good? That's when my dad, who usually tried to play the mediator, finally spoke up. "We've been using it to cover some expenses for the family," he admitted, as if that was supposed to make it better. "But don't worry, it's not all gone." Not all gone. That phrase hit me like a truck. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I'd just heard. "What do you mean, not all gone? How much is left?" Neither of them answered me right away, which told me everything I needed to know. I felt my stomach drop. "How much?" I demanded. My mom crossed her arms and said, "We'll get it back. We've made some investments." "What investments?" I interrupted, my voice rising. What did you do with my money? They finally came clean, or at least as clean as they were willing to get. Apparently, my dad had decided to use part of the money to invest in a sure thing a coworker had pitched him, some kind of real estate deal that was guaranteed to double his investment. That deal fell through, and now the money was tied up in some legal mess. Meanwhile, my mom had taken another chunk to help with household improvements, like the new car, the remodeled kitchen they just started on, and, oh yeah, the Europe trip. I was furious. This wasn't your money to spend. It was mine. Do you even realize what you've done? My mom rolled her eyes. Don't be so dramatic. We're your parents. Everything we've done is for you and this family. No, I shot back. Everything you've done is for yourselves. You didn't even ask me. You just took it. The conversation spiraled from there, with them defending their actions and me trying to explain that they'd ruined my chances of attending my dream school. My dad said something about how I could always go to a cheaper college, and my mom made a snide comment about how kids shouldn't act entitled when they haven't worked a day in their lives. It felt like they weren't even listening to me anymore. That night, I locked myself in my room and started going through every piece of paperwork I could find. I needed to know exactly how much was left of the money, but every time I asked, they dodged the question or gave me vague answers. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, when my parents were out, I went snooping through my dad's home office. I figured if they were using my money, there had to be some kind of record of it. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In a drawer, under a stack of old tax documents, I found a file labeled with my name. Inside was a bank statement for an account I'd never seen before. My stomach churned as I scanned the paper. The original deposit from my grandfather was there, but the withdrawals that followed made me feel sick. Tens of thousands gone in just a few months. By the time I reached the most recent balance, I felt like throwing up $32,000. That was all that was left. I couldn't believe it. They had blown through over $200,000 of my money in less than a year. And for what? A kitchen remodel? A car? A vacation? I felt so betrayed. I didn't know what to do. But then I noticed something else in the file. A contract? It was for the real estate investment my dad had mentioned, and it confirmed that he had put $50,000 into it. What caught my eye, though, was the name of the company. It was one I vaguely recognized because I'd seen it in the news recently for being under investigation for fraud. At that point, I realized this was bigger than just bad decisions. My parents hadn't just spent my money recklessly. They'd put it into something that could potentially disappear entirely. I wanted to scream, but instead, I took photos of everything in the file with my phone. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I needed proof of what they'd done. That night, I confronted them again, this time armed with the bank statement and the contract. You spent almost all of it, I said, throwing the papers down on the table in front of them. And now what's left is tied up in a scam? My dad tried to defend himself, saying he didn't know the company was under investigation when he invested. My mom doubled down on the whole, "We're your parents, we know what's best" argument, but it didn't matter. I wasn't buying it anymore. I'm done, I told them. I'm calling Grandpa. He needs to know what you've done. My mom panicked. Don't you dare, she said, her voice rising. Do you have any idea how humiliating that would be for us? Good, I said. You should be humiliated. I went back to my room and called my grandfather, fully expecting him not to answer. To my surprise, he picked up after a few rings. I explained everything, how they'd taken the money, how they'd spent most of it, and how what was left was tied up in a potentially fraudulent investment. He didn't say much while I talked, but I could tell he was angry. By the end of the call, he told me to sit tight and not say anything else to my parents until he had a chance to deal with it. I didn't know exactly what he was planning, but I trusted him. What I didn't realize at the time was just how messy things were about to get. 2 days later, my grandfather showed up unannounced. I was in my room when I heard the front door open and his deep voice boom through the house. We need to talk. Now. The tone in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My parents must have been just as caught off guard as I was, because there was a long silence before my mom finally stammered, "What's going on?" I came downstairs to see my grandfather standing in the living room, holding a folder that looked suspiciously similar to the one I'd found in my dad's office. He saw me, gave me a quick nod, and turned back to my parents. "Why don't you start by explaining what you did with the money I gave to my name?" My dad tried to play it cool, but his nervous smile betrayed him. "We've just been managing it for her," he said, his voice overly calm. "You know, making sure it's being used responsibly." "Responsibly?" my grandfather repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call blowing through over $200,000 in less than a year?" My mom stepped in then, trying to deflect. "We've been making investments for her future. It's not as simple as it looks on paper." My grandfather cut her off. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the bank statements. I've seen the contracts. You spent the money on yourselves, new cars, a trip to Europe, and some incredibly stupid real estate scam. Do you think I wouldn't find out?" The color drained from my mom's face. My dad looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "We didn't mean for it to get out of hand," my dad mumbled. "We thought we could grow the money, and then there'd be even more for her when she needed it. And yet here we are," my grandfather said coldly. "You didn't grow the money. You spent it. And now you've put the rest into a scheme that's probably going to cost you everything." He turned to me then and said, "I'm sorry you had to deal with this. I should have been more careful about how I gave you the gift. That's on me. But I promise you, I'm going to fix this." He looked back at my parents. "You two, on the other hand, are going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions." My dad's voice cracked as he said, "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've spoken to my lawyer," my grandfather replied, "and we're filing a lawsuit to recover the money." The room went dead silent. My mom stared at him like he'd just slapped her. "You're suing us? We're family." "Family doesn't steal from each other," my grandfather shot back. "You didn't just take money from me. You stole from your own daughter. And I won't stand by and let you get away with it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A lawsuit? Against my own parents? Part of me felt guilty, like I was the one tearing the family apart, but another part of me felt vindicated. They'd betrayed my trust, and now they were finally facing the consequences. The next few weeks were pure chaos. My grandfather's lawyer sent my parents a formal notice demanding they return the money or face legal action. My dad tried to argue that they didn't have the money to give back, but the lawyer wasn't having it. He laid out all the ways they'd misused the funds and made it clear that they were in serious legal trouble. My parents didn't take it well. My mom cried constantly, blaming me for dragging the family into this mess. My dad became withdrawn, barely speaking to me unless he absolutely had to. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying that a lawsuit would ruin them financially and that I was being selfish for letting this happen. But every time I started to feel bad, I reminded myself that they were the ones who had caused all of this in the first place. It wasn't just the legal battle that made things tense. My grandfather wasn't the type to sit back and let things play out quietly. He started digging into every aspect of the situation, hiring private investigators to look into the real estate scam and even reaching out to the authorities to report potential fraud. It turned out the company my dad had invested in was part of a larger criminal operation, and the FBI was already building a case against them. One day, a pair of federal agents showed up at our house to question my dad about his involvement with the company. I watched from the staircase as they grilled him about the investment and whether he knew it was a front for money laundering. My dad insisted he had no idea, but the agents didn't seem entirely convinced. They left after about an hour, but the look on my dad's face told me he was terrified. Meanwhile, my grandfather wasn't letting up on the legal front. He filed an official complaint in court, accusing my parents of breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of funds. The lawsuit quickly gained traction, and my parents were forced to hire a lawyer to defend themselves. It was surreal watching them scramble to explain their actions, knowing they didn't have a leg to stand on. The court case brought out even more skeletons from the closet. During the discovery process, my grandfather's lawyer uncovered evidence that my parents had taken out loans against the house to fund some of their spending. They were drowning in debt, and the lawsuit was only making things worse. Despite everything, my parents refused to take responsibility. They kept insisting that they'd only been trying to do what was best for me, even as the evidence piled up against them. I started to realize that they weren't just selfish, they were delusional. They genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong, even as their world came crashing down around them. The tension in the house became unbearable. My mom alternated between screaming at me and giving me the silent treatment, while my dad spent most of his time locked in his office, presumably trying to figure out how to get out of this mess. I started avoiding them as much as possible, spending most of my time at friends' houses or at the library. One day, my grandfather called me and said, "Pack a bag. You're coming to stay with me for a while." I didn't hesitate. I threw some clothes into a suitcase and left that same afternoon. My parents didn't even try to stop me. Staying with my grandfather was a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But the battle was far from over, and I had no idea just how far my parents would go to try to save themselves. Living with my grandfather was like stepping into another world. His house was calm, organized, and free from the constant tension I'd grown used to. But even though I felt safer there, the situation with my parents continued to spiral. They were furious that I had left, and their lawyer had started pushing back harder against my grandfather's lawsuit. Every week brought new developments, some small, others shocking, and it felt like there was no end in sight. One of the first bombshells came when my grandfather's lawyer uncovered bank records, showing just how extensive my parents' spending had been. The $50,000 for the real estate scam was bad enough, but it turned out they'd also spent thousands on luxury items, expensive dinners, and even gifts for their friends. There were charges for spas, jewelry stores, and high-end electronics. My mom had even used some of the money to fund a side hustle selling skincare products, which had apparently gone nowhere. The lawyer laid everything out in a detailed report, and when I saw the sheer amount of money that had been wasted, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Meanwhile, my parents weren't making things any easier for themselves. They had started trying to frame the situation as a family misunderstanding, claiming that my grandfather was overreacting and that the money was never really stolen. They even tried to paint me as ungrateful, telling anyone who would listen that I'd turned against them over a simple mistake. They went so far as to call some of our relatives to try to gain sympathy, but it backfired spectacularly. Most of my extended family sided with my grandfather and me, and a few of them even stopped speaking to my parents altogether. Things took an even darker turn when my grandfather's private investigator uncovered evidence of fraud and how my parents had used the money. Apparently, they'd falsified some documents to secure the loans against the house, inflating their income to qualify for a larger amount. When this information was presented in court, it was a game changer. Not only did it strengthen my grandfather's case, but it also opened the door for potential criminal charges against my parents. The stress was clearly getting to them. My mom started calling me constantly, leaving voicemail after voicemail that ranged from tearful apologies to angry rants about how I'd ruined the family. My dad, who had always been more reserved, sent a long email trying to justify their actions. He claimed they had only spent the money because they thought they could provide a better life for me and argued that my grandfather's actions were tearing the family apart. It was all so manipulative that I didn't even bother responding. Around this time, I decided to get more involved in the legal process. I met with my grandfather's lawyer and shared everything I knew about how my parents had handled the money. I also handed over the photos I'd taken of the bank statements and the real estate contract, which turned out to be critical pieces of evidence. The lawyer was impressed with how organized I was and told me I'd done the right thing by documenting everything. That validation meant a lot, especially since my parents had spent months trying to make me feel like I was in the wrong. As the case progressed, it became clear that my parents were in serious trouble. The fraud allegations were enough to warrant an investigation by the authorities, and before long, my dad received a summons to appear in court. Watching everything unfold was surreal. I never imagined my own family could end up in a legal battle like this, but at the same time, I knew they had brought it on themselves. One of the most intense moments came when my parents were deposed. I wasn't there in person, but my grandfather's lawyer later described it to me in detail. Under oath, my dad admitted to using the money for personal expenses, but insisted he had always planned to pay it back. My mom, on the other hand, broke down in tears and claimed she hadn't realized how much money they were spending until it was too late. Their testimonies were filled with contradictions and excuses, and by the end of it, they had only made themselves look worse. Despite everything, my parents still refused to settle. They clung to the hope that they could somehow avoid paying back the money, even as their legal bills continued to pile up. Their lawyer tried to negotiate a deal, But my grandfather wasn't interested. He told me privately that he wanted to see this through to the end, not just for me, but to send a message that their behavior was unacceptable. The final blow came when the real estate scam my dad had invested in collapsed completely. The company was shut down, and its founders were arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. My dad lost the $50,000 he had put into it, and the news made headlines in our local paper. It was humiliating for my parents, and they couldn't even pretend it was just bad luck. Everyone knew they had ignored all the warning signs. With their financial situation in shambles, my parents started to unravel. My mom stopped going to work, and my dad began drinking more heavily. They even tried to sell some of the luxury items they had bought, but it barely made a dent in their debts. Meanwhile, my grandfather and I focused on preparing for the trial. We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we were determined to hold them accountable. In the midst of all this, I started to think about what my life would look like once the case was over. I knew I couldn't go back to living with my parents, even if things somehow improved between us. My grandfather encouraged me to focus on my future, and he even offered to help cover the costs of college so I could still pursue my dream. His support meant everything to me, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had a real chance to move forward. But the battle was far from over, and as the trial date approached, tensions reached a boiling point. My parents were desperate, my grandfather was determined, and I was stuck in the middle, wondering how it would all end. The day of the trial felt unreal. My parents showed up looking tense and disheveled, a stark contrast to their usual composed selves. My grandfather and I sat on the other side of the courtroom with his lawyer, who was calm and confident. As proceedings began, I could see my mom wiping her hands nervously on her skirt, while my dad avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. The case wasn't overly complicated, which meant it moved quickly. The judge started by summarizing the situation. My grandfather had given me a large sum of money, my parents had taken control of it without my consent, and the majority of it had been spent or lost in questionable ways. The fraud tied to the real estate investment was also a factor, but it wasn't the main focus of the civil suit. The goal here was simple: to recover as much of the money as possible and hold my parents accountable for their actions. The first witness was my grandfather. He testified about the circumstances of the gift, explaining that he had given me the money to help with my education and future, not for my parents to use as they pleased. He was calm and measured, but you could hear the disappointment in his voice. When the lawyer asked him how he felt about the situation, he paused for a moment before saying, "I trusted them to do the right thing, and they betrayed that trust. It's as simple as that." Next, I was called to the stand. I was nervous, but I knew this was my chance to tell my side of the story. I explained how I had discovered the missing money, the arguments with my parents, and how their actions had affected my ability to attend my dream college. The lawyer walked me through the evidence I had collected, including the photos of the bank statements and the real estate contract. As I spoke, I noticed my mom shaking her head slightly, as if she couldn't believe what I was saying, but I kept my focus on the judge and jury. When it was my parents' turn to testify, things got messy. My dad went first, and his testimony was a mix of excuses and half apologies. He claimed that he had only taken the money to help the family, and that he had always intended to pay it back. The lawyer pressed him on why he hadn't consulted me before making such a significant decision, but my dad deflected, saying he thought I was too young to understand how to manage that kind of money. My mom's testimony was even more chaotic. She broke down in tears several times, insisting that she had never meant for things to get so out of hand. At one point, she tried to blame my grandfather, saying he had put too much pressure on them by giving me such a large sum of money in the first place. The judge quickly shut that down, reminding her that the case was about their actions, not my grandfather's generosity. The most damning moment came when my grandfather's lawyer presented evidence of the loans my parents had taken out against their house. It showed a clear pattern of reckless spending and financial mismanagement. The lawyer argued that my parents had not only squandered my money, but had also put themselves in an even worse financial position by taking on unnecessary debt. My parents' lawyer tried to counter by saying they had made honest mistakes, but the evidence was overwhelming. After several days of testimony and arguments, the case finally went to the jury. The deliberation didn't take long, less than 3 hours. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear. My parents were found liable for misappropriating the funds, and the court ordered them to repay the remaining $32,000 immediately. Additionally, they were required to pay damages to cover part of the lost money, bringing the total judgment to just over $100,000. The moment the verdict was read, my mom started crying again, while my dad just stared straight ahead, his face blank. I felt a wave of relief, but it was bittersweet. This wasn't a victory I could celebrate. It was just the end of a long and painful ordeal. The aftermath of the trial was just as messy as the trial itself. My parents didn't have the money to pay the judgment, so the court ordered the sale of several of their assets, including the remodeled kitchen appliances and my mom's designer bags. They were also forced to downsize their home, moving into a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood. The humiliation was clearly taking a toll on them, and while part of me felt bad for them, I couldn't forget the choices they had made that brought them to this point. I stayed with my grandfather during this time, focusing on rebuilding my life. True to his word, he helped me cover my college expenses, and I was able to start classes that fall. Being at school was a welcome escape from everything that had happened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. As for my relationship with my parents, it remains strained to this day. We talk occasionally, but things are far from normal. They've apologized several times, but their apologies always feel hollow, like they're more focused on repairing their image than on making things right. I've come to accept that I may never fully trust them again, and I'm okay with that. The whole experience taught me a lot about family, trust, and standing up for myself. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but it's one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. While I wish things had turned out differently, I'm grateful for the support of my grandfather and the chance to move forward on my own terms. If there's one thing I know for sure, it's that I'll never let anyone take advantage of me like that again.